in the last decade, there's been $4.1 billion worth of US dollars of funding within the contact sector, and actually only 521 million has been BIM. Where's all the rest of this money been going? Only 161 has been in smart tools, and the vast majority of it has been in project management technologies, and the big bit being information management. And the biggest thing that everyone seems to be asking for us now is, I want a digital twin. How does that all plug into ISO 19650? Before I do that, just a really brief introduction. Turner Townsend, we've got over 6,000 employees. We're a global project management, cost management, and technology consultant. We're spread across the globe. We have been in Canada for 26 years. This is my colleague David Thompson. If you want to have direct contact with him, I believe he's at the conference as well. If you have any queries specifically about how we can support you in Canada. But we've got 6 regional offices, and we have been working on some interesting BIM projects already in the area. So what does Turner Townsend Technology do? Well, actually quite a lot of things, but a lot of it focuses around really developing the narrative for clients, making sure that they are engaged and understand the benefits of digital technology, and really work hand in hand with them to help create returns on their investment on any capital procurement project they work on, and also any of their asset management. And that allows us to really think about, how they can get from A to B. Well, what's B for them? Well, most clients are now saying to us, I want a digital twin. And they have no idea how they're going to get to that. That's just the new thing that they've heard about. And invariably, actually what we do to start with is assess where they're at, is to understand, do they have any digital maturity? Do they have any capability internally? And often they're kind of failing at the first hurdle. They don't necessarily have a base level of digital technology applied to any of their projects. They might need information management strategies. They need BIM and various other things to do with reality capture. Some of them are a bit better, and they start looking at how they can use digital to leverage and reduce risk. They might be using modern methods of construction, or e-tendering, or digital facilities management. They very much layer on top of the first layer. If you haven't done the structured information management, I'll keep looping back to that, you can't really do the next layer. And then finally, the connected IoT, using AI, they all start plugging in together to get to you closer to where a digital twin might be. It's different for every single organization, but unless we go right back to the very beginning and say, okay, well, you need to have an information management strategy, will fail probably. So we have all this digital technology, and we have all these various tropes that plug in together to make this pie. But the reality is that digitizing a problem won't make it anything more than just a digital problem. It's a people problem often. And actually, us analyzing the way the company works and the people that they have, and how their capability can be enhanced, and how supporting skills and consultants working alongside them can become part of this whole overarching strategy, is how you're going to get adoption irrespective of the company base, size, or their location. One of the big outputs, really, and I think everyone on this call should really ask themselves this question too, is where is your digital maturity? Are you fledgling? Are you developing, but you might have an appetite but limited trust in the data? Are you kind of capable? You've not had those case studies to really demonstrate to your directors that it actually works, but you've got a strategy in place. Are you actually mature? Are you already producing high quality data and you've got a clear strategy for continuation? Or are you optimized? I've not met anyone who's optimized. So there's a long way for all of us to go, to be honest with you. But I think ultimately future businesses will have a single vision around how digital is part of the way in which they run. So why aren't we doing better? What are the challenges? Well, if I circle back to why don't we trust our data, I think one of the core reasons is because we still think of data like pieces of paper and putting them into boxes. And the trouble is that works very well in a small project when you've only got a few boxes, but as soon as the project grows, it becomes very, very difficult to manage. It doesn't scale particularly well. When you get onto bigger and bigger projects, you have multiple folders and it becomes very, very difficult for anyone to navigate. You can lose things because people don't understand where they should put them in those boxes. And indeed, you can end up with duplications of those files because people are putting them in various locations because they're guessing, completely undermining the integrity of this information sharing strategy in a digital way. The converse of this is to say, well, why don't we add metadata or indeed just labels to all of the objects that we're putting inside a single container? It's initially much more complex to set up, and as my the great presentation by WSP before me said, is that it's very difficult on small projects to really justify those kinds of things. But if you talk to clients on a bigger scale and say, well, you might have a constellation of small projects, it scales much more easily because that single container can absorb all of this, and it's the metadata that allows the self-organization. It also means that you can filter and control how much stuff is added to the system, and you can easily search it and filter it and only provide certain levels of information to people instead of asking them to search in folders. And then if we start thinking about how that might link out, because it's structured, it can link to other platforms, and then it can become part of an information architecture. Whereas it's actually very, very difficult to do it with the former system. But nonetheless, and this is information from the digital economy strategy, SME adoption of technology and small medium enterprises are essentially companies below 200. So that's probably many organizations on this call. They were surveyed in 2017, and the issue that they found was that actually adopting digital was not just part of their business strategy. So that's why they didn't do it. Interestingly, some of them said they didn't adopt it and they had no reason to adopt it. Not adopt it, they just didn't feel like it. I think the other one is saying, okay, what if we were adopting digital technologies, which ones have we adopted? Internet, websites, they're pretty obvious ones. Everybody seems to have those kinds of things. But it rapidly falls off, not only in our immediate peers from the UK, France and Germany, but also in terms of just how the appetite for sharing your information with your project colleagues, your relative stakeholders. There's very little appetite, and this is a problem that's endemic in construction, that actually firms don't really want to put all their information onto a system. And that's what the ISO standards are trying to help us enable to do better in a more structured and ultimately fair way. The other issue is that actually skill. So we might have lots of young people trying to join the construction sector. And there's certainly a big problem in the UK, is that by becoming so wedded by being very protective and siloed in our thinking, we actually end up losing the great skill that could be joining us and helping us supercharge us in our next kind of wave of success. And the Farmer Review, which is a really interesting read as well, predicted that by 2025 that there'll be a reduction in labour by 25%. So all that skill that we're training is then just leaving because they're fed up with working. And then this year, obviously the dramatic issue is to do with changing of working patterns as well. The construction sector, certainly in the UK, has a real big gender problem. So that's 50% of the skilled, capable thinking that could be improving how we collaborate. And there's a huge proportion of people who've now started formally becoming part-time workers, and 46% of all the people surveyed in professional careers at some point during 2020 worked from home, and I think that will continue. So the need to share things digitally in a structured way has become far more important than it ever has been. So what are the opportunities? If I start saying we're going to adopt those things, what are the opportunities our clients are seeing? Well, actually, the UK has said all of these companies need a bit of a leg up. They're actually going to give them funding. Now, obviously, I'm not familiar with the Canadian situation, but in the UK, innovation and adoption of digital technologies is actually, you get heavy funding benefits for doing those kinds of things. Innovate UK, through the Digital Built Britain strategy in 2016, started to build on these kinds of notions of how we could actually start providing innovation loans and ways in which companies could progress and improve and adopt these technologies and standards. And equally, that meant that any kind of organization, be it the client, could become more informed. They could start adopting CDEs and become more digital in the way they do things. Design firms and contractors could start adopting digital technologies they couldn't previously afford to do so. So like on-site verification using point clouds, or off-site construction, adoption of digital health and safety records. And finally, the facilities managers could start becoming more digital in the way that they did things. They had a trust of information that flowed into their system. They could start really relying on IoT and potentially even start managing their assets through digital twins. That's where the opportunities lie. So that was a whistle-stop tour, and I think all of that we see actually feeds back into this narrative of saying structured information management is the bedrock of being able to do all these other more ambitious things. So the final point I'm just going to say in terms of just warming you all up is that a study that was just produced by KPMG and the Centre for Digital Britain found that if a CDE and information management is properly adopted across a whole project, then for every Canadian dollar that is spent, you will get a return on investment of $5, which is game-changing really in terms of statistics. So I encourage you to all look at that one. So case studies. I've kept you all excited about what that case study could be. So one of our biggest commissions within our technology department in the UK was the HMRC office rationalisation. And although the project did start actually back in 2016, the main delivery of all of the buildings, the 13 regional hubs, have been over the last 3 years. And it's a massive consolidation from 170 offices and 45,000 employees into new top spec offices. And the idea being that by creating an optimized state-of-the-art working environment, they'll get greater efficiencies. Part and parcel to that is saying, okay, well, they want a digital asset to help them manage them going forward. And all of that, the backbone of that, as you can see those dates, effectively predates the ISO 19650 standards. So they were built around the BS 1192 suite, which is extremely close and is essentially the predecessor of the ISO standard, and was indeed, the ISO standards were authored by the same people, or near enough the same people. So David Churcher and Paul, who's on the panel next, are some of the authors of the ISO standard. The complexity here is that although this was one single program, there was a different contracting team appointed for every single building. And this is the base build element. And then a different contracting team was also appointed for the fit out of each of these offices. So the only thing consistent is the client and Turner Townsend. So how do we then make sure that there's some kind of parity, some standardization across all of this? Well, there was an opportunity for a program level integrated scope. So one single environment for how we shared data. Everything was structured. We used Viewpoint for this particular thing on a program basis. The standards in which we shared information was the same, irrespective of the project. There's a program-wide information management, employers' information requirements, and asset information requirements. There's a supply chain capability assessment. So we're going in and actually measuring the capability of the suppliers to be actually able to deliver this in advance of their appointments. If you can't do it, you're not appointed. There's continuous reviews of each of the contractors' BIM execution plans so that they're demonstrating how that they can actually deliver against the employer's information requirements. We act as a digital guardian, so we're continuously measuring the quality of their BIM models and their other digital deliverables onto the Viewpoint system. And we're also providing digital reporting through dashboards so that there's some kind of high-level insights and analytics that the client can do without the need for proprietary software. They don't need to know Revit. They just want to know whether it's going well. And ultimately, the whole aim of that is to be consistent, compliant, and insightful. Now, one interesting thing is that we also developed a strategy for the software platforms that we're going to be used at each stage of the projects as well, so that there was a real understanding of where value could be added and platforms that could be used. And you'll note that we've tried to be quite agnostic as well. There are some design platform requirements as well, but there are also quite a lot of other things as well to do with Celebri and Matterport, etc., that help better quality throughout the whole of the project. One of the critical elements here as well was to get engagement from the end user perspective from HMRC. And what we did is we created a whole narrative for various people that would potentially exist within the individual buildings or at the program level. So these various horizontal lines are the individuals that might actually end up using the assets. So we've got the facilities manager in the top row. We've got an actual person who works in the building. You've got an asset manager. You've got a refurbishment contractor. And you've also got a national executive. And how do they interact on the various steps? Traditionally, a lot of these individuals might not have been engaged at all, but through the framework of these standards and the EIR, we actually were able to develop a much better and richer set of requirements because we engaged with the client and helped inform them. So that was how we developed that stage. And as it went through this step, that allowed us to then have essentially managed expectations for how they were going to operate and maintain the building throughout. And that's essentially in alignment with the PAS 1192 Part 3 and now subsequently the ISO 19650 Part 3. And those various levels of processes allowed for future innovations as well. So, for example, retroactively adding sensors into buildings later on. And then that further allowed us to then create a long-term strategy for them. And that's very much in line with the ISO 55000 standards in terms of how you need to create a long-term view of how you're going to manage your assets going forward. And essentially, the end step of this is also talking about how we might retain or dispose the properties, how we're going to reuse BIM data. We're going to see what kind of materials we've got in there, and there's going to be a building safety bill that comes out in the UK very shortly, which is essentially saying that owners may well have to continuously maintain their BIM models to be able to demonstrate that they don't have unsafe materials downstream, which is a really interesting development as well. So how did we what kind of beneficial things were happening during the project? Well, as I mentioned before, we were able to do at a program level across the whole of the UK comparative analysis of progress of various buildings, look at them from case studies, the individual models of each of the suppliers, how compliant they were for data and geometry, and then what impacts that might have to the design and how that all fed together. Also, we were able, because we had structured data, we were able to directly feed the model data into Costex, and our cost managers were able to actually have a high level of reliance on the models to assess the performance and accuracy of buildings, and indeed start to input directly into the design rather than kind of having this very long feedback loop, allowing them to actually assess really accurately what the quantum of materials were, and really be a critical designer essentially in inputting results back to the contractors and their design changes for the fit out phase as well. And it's obviously filtered down in a very familiar fashion. Equally, we had consistent data across all of those 13 projects. So we used the BS 1192 Part 4 standard, the COBE standard. So every asset would be exported as an IFC with standardized COBE data that we then would assess for completeness as well. And you can see it also, our standardized system is the Uniclass, not the Omniclass system for categorization. And that allowed us to have parity across all of the assets. Also, we were able to assess security of the assets themselves and help the built asset security managers. So that's Part 5, which now has been published, I believe, the ISO Part 5. This is extremely fast, apologies, but essentially this allowed us to validate the positioning of security cameras, access vents, so that they weren't too high, the positioning of the access doors. There's a bit of a scrambling happening with the image, apologies. The position of data security cabling, and also the internal positioning of security cameras. I will probably publish that on a separate YouTube channel, because that seems to have a history of not wanting to present, so apologies on that one. A second case study, I know this is a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I'm keen to also talk about a second case study that is actively using the ISO standard. So this is in the design phase at this exact moment. So this is a mature client. They've done a number of projects before. They've delivered projects to close to BIM level 2, not necessarily full BIM level 2, because they're a private client. They have appointed us as their BIM and information management lead, which is interesting. It's a slightly different interpretation that maybe some would have. But that allowed us to create a unified AIR, EIR, and model production and delivery table to help them have consistency across all of their projects that were going to be delivered. And then they took the decision to adopt 19650 in 2020. So some of the projects were already in play. That meant that they had to update. It wasn't as onerous as you might think. There was a great, there's a transitional document that was also published as part of the standards that helped projects that were already in play adopt that. And essentially this project is over 4 phases and is near enough £750 million in terms of construction budget. So if we can save 1% or a couple percent through efficiencies for adopting digital, we're saving millions of pounds. So there's a really big incentive with these kinds of clients to do these kinds of things. Now, what are the challenges? So whilst they're quite mature and they understand that processes need to be validated, they want to have all of the design team delivering models onto their CDE, and they want the BIM lead to do validation checks of the data in there. Then COVID happened, and the traditional methodology of everyone meeting together and discussing around one screen fell flat. How could we have improved that process? The client had no access to Revit anyway, so they still were a bit kind of blind as to how this all worked. It was a bit kind of going into an opaque box for them. And they found it, and users would continually feedback and say, I've got thousands of clashes on this clash list. I can't identify where they are in my native models. What am I going to do? Equally, there was often inconsistency with issue tracking depending on the different people that are involved. An architect might have one way of talking about things, whereas the engineers might talk in a different way. And furthermore, there was limited prioritization. So they're all the most urgent thing. It's the last thing I saw and it's urgent, and things kind of rapidly get pushed down underneath piles of other things that become very important. So we realized that there was a significant opportunity for us to be an advocate of better, efficient processes using these standards to help us then put things on the cloud and democratize this knowledge. What we ended up using is a platform called BIM Collab, which there's a few of them on the market, but it essentially uses the BCF platform format that connects clash information and issue tracking into a cloud-based viewing platform, which you see here, but it goes direct back into native models. So it allowed everyone to log in on their own versions of what they could see and click on the same issue number. So if we wanted to talk about issue number 212, then everyone could click on 212 whilst they were in their platform, be it Revit or Navisworks, etc., and see the issue themselves and navigate around and then comment and interact directly on this. Only because this whole notion of collaborative working was built into their appointment, does thus become something that's very easy for everybody to start adopting and become standardizing their process. The other thing that we were also able to do was start to say, okay, well, let's put health and safety data back into the models during the design phase. Typically, the health and safety data is something that's done in kind of isolation. it's done as just a schedule that's kind of reported in the back, and maybe it might just reference rooms. But if we're already going through this lengthy process of creating structured data in all of our containers, our rooms and spaces are named in a structured way according to the standards that we've already adopted, and everyone understands those things. All we have to do is connect the room naming on one form of structured data to another form of structured data, CSV connecting to a SQL file using Dynamo. So this is an example of how we managed to connect that, essentially using the designers models, collecting the room data and associating those bits of data to avatars that we would then place in spaces. So each of those avatars then had symbols on there, so that immediately created a much richer model for everyone to navigate. It became something that could be used downstream, but it could also be used by the health and safety manager, who previously all he had was a schedule. So it's quite interesting how this creating a narrative of collaboration allows us to kind of move data around and start creating things that are more beneficial to everybody. And the final element, I did touch on digital twin and how this all kind of maybe fits together, is to think about the widest ecosystems. I mentioned an information architecture. Well, in the BIM world, typically this might be the kind of limit of where people might consider a digital twin to kind of exist. There's you're creating your enriched asset information model and you're going to view it. And that can be beneficial, certainly for computer-aided facilities management. But live data, hundreds of millions of data points, should be associated back to this so that you can actively see and manage the problems that are occurring, so that you can respond rather than react to issues that you're having in your building. That means connected to the BMS. That also means sensors that check occupation. You can see issues in the building. It also means advocacy and connecting it to the residents or the users themselves, so they have an app to report problems with the building or book spaces, and it's all in some kind of management CRM. And finally, there should be some kind of relationship with governance, data, and those charts that I showed you on Power BI. So the financial decision makers can actually start making a decision based on profit and loss and return on investment. How that all connects together? Well, you need something like Azure to connect it all together, of course. But if you don't set the whole agenda and the whole culture of creating structured data, even if you're the smallest supplier of information at the beginning of the project when you're starting to design, and the client recognizing that this is big payback over a long duration, you're never going to get to this point. And that's the kind of key thing that we need to consider about why ISO is so incredibly important for any client that says, I want to do a digital twin. You need to immediately say to them, have you adopted ISO 19650? And I think that's everything from me, Thomas.
Well, that was a great presentation. Thank you so much. Very informative, and it's kind of nice to hear from someone from the UK that's kind of on the ground there, working on projects all the time, to get your perspective. So, and I think you did that last couple of slides you presented there. Did a nice job of sort of like tying it all together in the overall value proposition. So, regarding producing a digital twin deliverable, do you think that is the most important use case for introducing the ISO standard, or do you think that introducing this framework is applicable to all jobs all the time?
Honestly, I think it's all jobs all the time, because certainly, what we're seeing now is just legislation just around building safety and all these kinds of things, is that there'll be such a level of accountability from everyone in the supply chain, is that actually being able to kind of digitize your workflows and being under the same framework of how you share your information will actually reduce the amount of work you're going to have to do from an administrative level. I think I've always seen with anyone that I work with, if they see an immediate payback themselves for doing something, then they're much more likely to adopt it across all of their projects without being asked, rather than being told by a client they have to do it.
The project that I've been involved with, where there has been a requirement to deliver a model for facilities management or an asset model or digital twin, however you define that, it's been my experience that trying to drive requirements into the early stages of the projects to extract information from everyone along the way, when there's so many moving parts to the design that's in flux and the suppliers haven't selected equipment yet. There's so many decisions and things that happen over the course of the construction. We actually have found that it's more cost effective to address that requirement at the end of the job before it's turned over to the client, but collect all that information and put together through a devoted effort rather than trying to orchestrate that effort across many, many groups over an extended period of time. But it seems like the ISO is designed specifically for that. I'm just wondering, like, have you been through both methodologies? And in the UK, when there's a digital twin requirement or deliverable, have you seen it work both ways? Have you had experience?
I think there's you're right. There's very much the kind of rabbit from a hat kind of style way of delivering a project, where ultimately the way that ends up working out is the client has to take responsibility for kind of correcting lots of it, and
right.
recognizing there's going to be a lot of data drop off by people that have been paid, and they leave the scene pretty sharpish. And,
right.
And that's actually can be very large organizations. That's their scope, and there's no one's kind of holding them to anything else.
And it's very hard to measure. I mean, either way you cut it, it's very hard to get into a model and analyze it against the actual site condition.
Exactly right, and that's why taking a step back and just saying, okay, what does the client or the decision makers actually want to know? They don't want to learn how to use models. They don't want to have to learn how to. Many of them don't even want to have to learn how to read a plan, to be honest with you, and they never will. What they want to know is risk, how much they're spending, what they're going to be spending next month against things, whether it's on track or not. So digitizing a lot of these processes and allowing it to be in a central repository starts to become very, very amenable to them, because they're saying, well, okay, I can start to bring all these bits of information together. It's a hell of a lot easier if everybody's doing that under the same framework, because it's a whole nother topic to start talking about.
It's more repeatable.
Well, it's a whole other topic to talk about smart contracts, but I think that's inevitable too. That if you're either able to do a smart contract as a supplier or you're not, and if you can't do it, then you will just miss out on lots of work too. So I think it's
interesting. I mean, in our market, it tends to be that the people that supply the most scarce commodity control the market, and in our market, that's labor. It's very hard to find skilled labor and companies that are willing to take on risk to pour concrete. So they tend to they have there's a competitive process, but the cost of things is going up and up and up because there's so few companies and so little skilled labor. So layering on requirements saying, hey, we want you to pour this concrete, coordinate all your work, as well as deliver this digital requirement through this complicated framework. It's kind of a tough push, right? So I don't know. I've found that gathering the information that you can throughout the process and then putting it together at the end of the job is kind of a more predictable, although less efficient way. But I think the hope is by introducing this standard that we're going to create some muscle memory with organizations on how you collaborate and communicate, and everyone will get used to the same framework, I guess, is the vision around this. Are you seeing that in the UK in your experience? I mean, and a question I asked Alex at WSP regarding the size of projects. What's your opinion? I mean, what's happening in the UK? Is this every project everywhere is using this standard, or is this, the $100 million marquee projects where you can write an article and show off the use of it? I mean, what stage are you at?
That's a good point. I mean, I think the ones that have had the highest level of success obviously have a higher level of expense because they're able to bring in specialist consultants like ourselves. How that starts to get drip fed back through the rest of the economy starts to become, where's the drop off there? Well, I think interestingly, in terms of just the continual development of the UK industry of contracting and the skills in there, is that often they're starting to find that they're getting greater efficiencies in risk reduction themselves in being able to use better technologies for how they do things. And certainly a massive change in the UK is off-site construction, which I know actually is already very popular in residential in Canada anyway. Right. Very new for us.
Starting there, yeah.
But the backbone of that seems to be, well, you really need to use models in BIM to get the best out of this manufacturing style of workflow rather than experience, because we don't really have experience in that area. So we've just kind of said, okay, that's how you're going to do it. Equally, certain materials, you might say, okay, well, they're traditional, really expensive. There's a point where they become so expensive that clients go, you know what, I'm willing to try something else. I'm willing to try, mass timber, because it's no longer cost prohibitive. All I need is a bit more data and a better resolved design model in order for me to be able to access that. So it starts to become a financial decision once again for them to be able to change the market itself.
Is there a concern in the market with bifurcating companies that operate at a certain level of sophistication and can respond to an ISO requirement, and the rest of the kind of mom and pop organizations that don't have the engineering and R&D cash flow to be able to support this type of approach on work?
Yeah, I mean, I know some of the other. I'm sure Raoul will mention this as well. So there were a lot of kind of, it was a bit of the Wild West kind of actually a decade ago in the UK, where a lot of people who maybe even just had good intentions, but just didn't really know what they were talking about, became BIM consultants and offered services for people, and actually wasted a lot of people's money and time on projects. And I think there's always the danger of that one. But I suppose the benefit of being a fast follower rather than an early adopter like ourselves is that we've kind of been through the pain of realizing you need all these various modules to make the standard work. It was originally just one part, and it's grown into 6+ in order for you to actually be able to do a digital project. So the framework in which you start a digital project now within ISO, I think, is actually much more rigorous and can work more effectively for anyone who wants to do it.
So I guess one more quick question, and we should wrap up because we're running really late here. But are you finding that this standard is amongst government projects? It's 100% of the time you're seeing it on projects there, and a percentage of the time with private work, or how does it shake down?
I think the interesting thing is that the private ones tend to move very quickly. They really want to see a return on it as well. So they might not go for 100% of things. They just need to make sure that there's a cost benefit for every single thing that they do. So they might cherry pick the standards. Whereas the converse is that the government sector might say, I want all of it, but then they don't necessarily employ the skill internally to really understand what they're doing. So it all just goes into a kind of digital bin at the end, which is a bit of a...
So you could be inflating the cost of work by specifying this if it's not well thought out and executed. Where on the private side, it's more sort of like, hey, let's work backwards from a problem. Let's work backwards from a value proposition and drive that use case. Okay, so I think we're going to wrap up here. We're running a little bit late. We're going to take a quick 2-minute break and get our panel together. So thank you very much, Mike. Very insightful. Really appreciate your presentation, and maybe we can reconnect on this subject in the future.
Fantastic. Thank you, Thomas.
Okay,
everyone. Cheers.